This is More Money with economist Steve Moore. Now, Steve Moore.
Welcome back, folks. This is the More Money Show. This is WABC. I am your host, Steve Moore. Thanks so much for joining. I always say this. I'm not the best radio talk show host, but I do get some of the best hosts. Some of the best guests in the business. And my next guest is a guy who's been a friend of mine and a crusader for freedom and the right to work and the right to prosper in this great country of ours, Mark Mix, who runs the Right to Work Foundation. Mark, thanks for joining and thanks for everything you do.
Well, Steve, thank you. You have been a leader and you're indefatigable in your fight for liberty and freedom. So I appreciate it. It took me a while to get that one out. That's a big syllable word for me, but thanks. It's good to be with you. Good to be with you.
You too. And so Mark and I have worked side by side on so many issues over the years. So I'm just thrilled to have him on. So Mark, I'm going to start with just a big, broad question, if I may, because you're the expert on labor and we all want American workers to be the best, highest paid, most productive workers in the world. And for the most part, they are. So what is the difference, Mark, between being pro-worker and pro-union?
Well, Steve, that is a really important question. It's extremely relevant right now as the new administration takes over and as you advise them. Here's the difference. The ideological power of organized labor officials is really growing really distant from the views of rank and file workers across the country. And we saw that in this last election. Steve,
yes.
If you look at the numbers, 62% of the Teamsters, according to Sean O'Brien, the Teamster president, voted for Donald Trump. And we know this. If you look at the private sector workforce, Donald Trump got a large majority of union households to vote for him in this last election. However, when you look at the money that's distributed from labor union officials and their political action committees and their general treasury funds, the Open Secrets just released the numbers. $60 million went directly to Kamala Harris, $284,000 to Donald Trump. So that's the best example of the disconnect between union officials and the rank and file workers they claim to represent across the country. And that's growing wider and wider over time. And Steve, as you know, we're down to about 5.9% of workers, private sector workers in America are members of unions. So their product they're selling is not something that workers are buying, that's for sure. But yet the political ideas of Donald Trump and the policy ideas of Donald Trump and this new Congress are attracting workers, like secure the border, lower taxes, lower regulation. You're the expert on those areas, Steve. Keeping men's out of women's bathrooms. That's bread and butter for union households and working Americans. And union officials are way out of touch. And that's being exposed dramatically right now.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think you've really nailed it, my friend. And if someone wants to voluntarily join a union, that's fine. I don't have a problem with it. I do believe in the right of association, and the right of association means if a bunch of workers want to get together and collectively bargain with the employer, I think they have every right to do so. What really bothers me, Mark, and you and I have talked about this over the years, is this idea that, to get a job, you would be forced to join the union. And we've been talking about this for 35 years, but it still happens in a lot of states.
Yeah, indeed. And Steve, despite the position you've been in, whether it be at the Wall Street Journal, whether it be you building organizations, or whether you being at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity now, you have been a proponent of that individual freedom. And I agree with you. That's exactly right. And federal law protects workers' rights to join unions, to associate if they want to voluntarily do that. Unfortunately, the labor policy from the 1930s includes that provision that force and coercion are really the bias in federal law. And that's what we've been fighting against all these years. And, I think union officials, if they just look at it realistically, look at the numbers, look at the people that want to be in unions. Gallup does a poll each year saying, 70% of people have a favorable opinion of unions, just like you, Steve. But when you ask them if they are interested in joining, it goes down to like 10% of people that are interested in joining. And that's probably because of the disconnect in the political world. You think Randy Weingarten, think Sean Fain, think these, these television symbols on TV running these unions. They're really out of step and out of touch with the American worker and, frankly, Americans in general.
So I'm a little nervous, Mark. I'm talking to Mark Mix, who is the venerable president of the National Right to Work Foundation. By the way, who was it? Who was it before you who actually kind of built this whole movement? It was I'm blanking on his name.
Yeah.
Oh, Reed Larson. What a great American he was, and I know he taught you well because you've done an amazing job keeping his legacy alive. So let's turn to what's happening in 2025, because there's a lot of labor issues that I've been meaning to talk to you about. One is that I'm not happy about this labor secretary. I'm nervous about the fact that she seems to not be in favor of right to work. What do you think? Tell us about this woman, and maybe I'm wrong, but what do you think?
Well, Steve, no, there is a real problem here, and she is a one-term congresswoman from Oregon.
What is her name again, Mark?
Lori Chavez DeRemer is her name.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And she was one of 3 Republicans to co-sponsor the PRO Act. And Steve, you and I have had the conversations not on the radio, but you and I have had conversations about the PRO Act. And the PRO Act, first and foremost, was a bill pushed by union officials and by then President Joe Biden. And the primary objective, number one thing it would do first and foremost, is repeal all the right to work laws across the country. I mean, it's a federal reimposition of forced unionism on those 26 states that had passed right to work laws over the last several years. So that in and of itself was enough to be against Lori Chavez DeRemer and question her views on individual freedom in the workplace that Donald Trump has articulated, over the last 8 years now. So that was very concerning. The PRO Act goes beyond that, though, Steve, and it says that it's going to redefine independent contractors to employees. We've talked about that in the past, too, where the idea is if you can't unionize independent employee or independent contractors, but you can unionize employees. She was for that. Mm-hmm. She was for the federal imposition of government union bargaining on the entire land. There was a bill introduced that said the federal government would audit the states, and if they didn't meet 4 core standards when it came to unionization of government employees, the federal government would impose that on the states. That's not what we need to do, Steve. You and Art Laffer do your rich state, poor state studies every year, and you show that labor policy and other economic policies are very important, and the laboratories of the states prove that these things make a difference. And the idea that you would impose forced unionization on government employees from the federal level to the state level is something that really, I don't think Donald Trump or anyone Americans really support that, except for a few union officials here in Washington, D.C.
That's Mark Mix, who's the president of the Right to Work Foundation. And I Mark, we have a lot of union members who are listening to this show right now. So, we both, if you're hardworking union members are, the backbone of our economy. I think it's unfair that people should be forced to join unions against their will. And that's what the labor bosses want. Now, there was an interesting development. I don't know if there's 2 interesting developments in our last few minutes, Mark, that I wanted to talk to you about. One is you wrote to me a week or 2 ago about the fact that we might be able to get New Hampshire to be a right to work. To remind our listeners, what is it? About 25 states are right to work, and about 25 states. What is the balance right now?
Yeah, current count is 26 right to work states. And unfortunately, Steve, we lost the bill in the New Hampshire legislature last week.
No.
Yeah, it's a 400-member legislature. I think it's like the 3rd largest legislative body in the world. And everybody in New Hampshire knows their state representative because they probably live next door. The vote was 200 to 180. We lost 25 Republicans on the vote. It was almost perfect attendance, which is really rare in the New Hampshire legislature. But we have another bill pending in Montana. We just got the bill introduced out there. We're going to hopefully get a vote on that one. We've been working in Utah. We've been working in a few other states, and we've been fairly successful. But New Hampshire is one we're going to have to tee up again and go after it again, and we'll just keep at it until freedom reigns in New Hampshire.
Now, the other state that I'm keeping an eye on is Wisconsin. I got a note from our friend Scott Walker, who was the governor there, saying he's nervous about what's happening there with respect to some of the rule changes that happened in Wisconsin. How concerned are you?
Very, very concerned, and see that's going to be a major fight as we head toward April in an election for a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin. Scott Walker saved taxpayers in Wisconsin about $30 billion by signing Act 10, which was a reform of the unionized bargaining system in Wisconsin. The judge now there, the election last year changed the complexion of that court. There's another election up right now, and if it goes poorly, it's very clear that the Supreme Court in Wisconsin will strike down Act 10, and then most likely they will go after the right to work law as well, saying it's unconstitutional. I mean, both the Act 10 and the right to work law in Wisconsin that passed in 2015, I believe it was, Scott Walker signed the right to work law, were litigated in the Seventh Circuit. They were litigated in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and both measures were upheld by the courts at that time. However, as you get a political change, obviously they relitigate, and here we are. A judge in Dane County has already struck down, quote unquote, Act 10. Obviously, the appellate court will hear it. The good news is that the expedited review that the unions wanted to get to the Supreme Court right away got denied. So there's going to be time to litigate it. But the election results in Wisconsin for that Supreme Court seat are going to make a huge difference on the future of that state.
One last point, Mark, that I wanted to bring up about Wisconsin, because it's sort of relevant about what's going on today. I'm sure you recall what happened when Scott Walker passed many of his reforms. The unions stormed the Capitol. Remember that? And they were camped out there for, I think it was at least a week. And Scott Walker's life was in danger. And I think about this in the context of what happened on January 6th, and I'm not. If anybody went into the Capitol, I think they probably deserve to be prosecuted. But Mark, no one was prosecuted in Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's right. Steve, these are unfortunate stories, but you're right. I mean, Indiana as well. When we passed the right to work law in Indiana in 2012, there were literally, I think, 7,000 to 10,000 union militants outside the Capitol, and they forced their way in. State police had to be called. It's really a sad story.
It's a double standard. It's a double standard.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. Yeah.
So last question, we got about 30, 45 seconds left before we have to take a hard break. Mark Mix, are you optimistic about the future of the American worker?
I am, Steve. I'm optimistic because I listen to you and Art Laffer and others talk about tax reform and regulatory reform and the things that could happen in the country if we could just bring a little more freedom and a little more control over this federal leviathan. And that includes compulsory unionism. If we can roll that back, then I think there's good wins headed to the United States for the next several years.
Well, Mark, I love it because, the statistic that you cited earlier, 94% of Americans are not in a union. So unions are not the powerhouse politically that they once were, and too often they don't really represent their members. Thanks so much for joining, Mark Mix, and we'll be right back. This is the More Money Show on WABC.